So I'm here at a new spot today, and I thought I would go over something that I haven't really seen covered that much. A lot of people talk about how to start a fire with various materials, where to find those materials, how to process those materials, but nobody really goes into the why. When should you reach for one type of fire starting tool like fat wood or waterproof matches or a ferro rod or a lighter or flint and steel versus another setting? And really, it all comes down to a few different elements. So I'm going to break down for you the reasons that I choose certain fire lighting techniques and reasons why, even though I like those other techniques, why I don't use them quite as much. So I'm going to start with the first thing that I use the most frequently, and that's fat wood. And if you don't know what fat wood is, I've explained this a lot in my videos. Fat wood is basically sap impregnated wood that comes from pines, and depending on where you live, it may also come into evergreens. For me, there's a few reasons why I reach for this before I reach for anything else. Number one is availability. So here in the Eastern Woodlands, I can trip over fat wood. I can go just about any place. And as a matter of fact, if I look around here, this is a hardwood forest. There's mostly hemlocks and there might be some poplars and so forth, and there's a lot of oaks. But if I walk 30 yards in that direction, I can trip over several stumps that are full of this stuff. It's so, for me, as long as I have the tools with me, which is usually a saw and a knife, sometimes I'll need a hatchet or a small forest axe. This is easy to process. I cut them into little pieces like this, and I look for these straight edges here, and I'll use the spine of my knife, or I'll just use curls or whatever. So I think number one for me in terms of why I choose what I choose is it available? Is it easy to find? And two, how well does it work? So I know that whether it's cold or wet or dry, fat wood is going to work for me. I would love if birch bark grew around here, but it just, we're not in an area where it really does. So that's why I pick fat wood before I pick anything else. We'll look at some other things though. If you didn't have fat wood, here I've got some weatherproof matches, and honestly, I haven't had the best experience with weatherproof matches. I'm not sure if it's my technique or not, but you strike it on this little guy right here, and you get a flame that lasts for a minute. You really kind of have to have really decent kindling for that to work, unless you're going to add this to something else. But it is lightweight, and when you're done with the case, you can, put redundancies. You can put petroleum jelly and cotton balls in here. So I would reach for this if I was backpacking and I didn't want to be processing or carrying with me something. So I might use this in conjunction with something like birch bark if I did have it. But it's not my favorite. And I honestly have a lot more luck with a ferro rod or a fire steel than I do with lighters, with those matches over there. I had a backpacking trip, which was not a super long one, where it was really cold. I was on the top of a ridge. It was 20 degrees, and the wind chill there was crazy. And all I wanted was a fire to keep myself warm. And I started out with those matches because they were easier. But it did take more dexterity in my hands to get that going. This tends to work no matter what, whether it's cold, whether it's wet, whether it's dry, or whether it's humid. You can get a spark as long as you have a good scraper. And you just get a lot more use out of it. So I could go through an entire box of these if the conditions are poor. And if I had the right materials, I could scrape these, and when it's cold and damp, I could use that in combination with my fat wood. And what I'll typically do when I do that is I'll get a small scrapings with the spine of my knife, and then I'll make shavings, usually not feathers, just a bunch of shavings. And then I'll take this piece and I'll split them into small kindling pieces. So it's kind of like doing a regular fire, where you have your smaller stuff, your larger stuff, and your other stuff. And I have used this in really wet, dry conditions, and I've been able to create a really good fire from that. One of my favorite ways to do this is to make a log cabin fire lay. I take several pieces of this, chop them up as kindling, and put them in the base of my fire, and let that build up so that you kind of have a log cabin fire lay within a log cabin fire lay. And that works really well. Okay. So one of my favorite ways of starting fire is with flint and steel. It's actually how I started this fire today, and one of the reasons why I made this video. So flint and steel is a really fun and primitive way to make fire. So here I have some char cloth that I try to keep free of moisture in this packet here. So I'll get my initial spark here with my flint. Somebody sent that to me. This does not grow naturally in my area. We do have quartz, but it's, you know, you really have to look around for it. So I get my initial spark on my char cloth, and I'll transfer that to some punk wood. And today I used some cedar. So the cedar is readily available. I can find that just about everywhere, and this is not very well processed, but the stuff I used for the fire was. I've thought a lot about flint and steel, and the reason why I don't use flint and steel in some situations and I do in others, but I'll give you a couple examples. So if I can find myself in a situation like today, for example, there's not a lot of good kindling here. I looked everywhere, and a lot of the stuff just didn't have a loud snap. It wasn't small enough. Some of it was partially dry, and I couldn't find a lot of pine around here or cedar. And those are the two trees that typically, because they're coniferous, they tend to keep those lower branches dry the longest. But I just couldn't find that. And that meant that for today, I really needed something that was going to be a more sustainable fire starting source, an accelerant, if you will, like the fat wood, that could build up that heat, could dry out those marginal kindling bundles, so that I would be able to get that initial heat source going and then add on my fuel. I like using this when conditions are optimal. That's a skill that I need to work on. But honestly, this is not something that I would reach for as my primary source. I do sometimes bring a good amount of kindling with me. Sometimes I find dry grass, and I put that in there. And it is fun and it's satisfying to use, but it really depends on what I have around me. So again, I'm surrounded by fat wood where I am right now, which would have dried out those larger, more marginal pieces of kindling that needed a little bit of extra time. But I did get the fire to work today. I had to really coax it into flame. I had to blow on the tinder bundle quite a bit, and I had to use kind of an elevator fire lay and move things around, and it did work. But the times when it's worked the best for me are the times when the kindling that I have is very small and very plentiful, and that tends to work really well. So good kindling for me is essential for this. All right, so this is a fire starter that we all love to hate. So we've got a Bic lighter here, and there are some things that I have noticed about Bics. So number one, you can remove this ring right here, and you can make this easier to use when you have less dexterity. So wintertime, I will tell you, I have not always had good luck with Bics in wintertime. And the rule with lighter is that 2 is 1, 1 is none. And what that means is If you bring one lighter with you, that lighter could fail, and then you don't have that lighter. But you bring 2 of them with you, the chances are one of them will work. Now, similar to an alcohol stove, the colder it gets, the less this is going to work for me. I have taken this out into 15, 20 degree trips, and I get this little tiny flame that comes up to like here. And then I take it home with me and go into my nice air-conditioned apartment, and I get this. I mean, right now, it's like 60, 70 degrees. So the temperature for the Bic makes a big difference for me. When I use a ferro rod like this one, it doesn't matter how cold it is. A spark is a spark, because you're removing that material from the rod. So this will work in any condition. So again, I guess I would use this if I was lazy. Not saying that if this is your go-to that you are lazy, but I'd use this if I didn't really feel like putting a lot of work into it. If I had really good materials, if things were dry, and if it wasn't too cold. So all of this is very subjective, of course. What I do is not necessarily going to be what you do. But just some things to keep in mind, that the conditions, the temperature, the moisture, the kind of kindling that you find makes a big difference in what you use. Whether you're going to use a natural material like fat wood, or some of this cedar bark here, which honestly you could use this with just a ferro rod. You don't need to use flint and steel. It's just fun, which is why I do it. Or whether you reach for something like this. It's fun to practice those primitive skills. So go out and use whatever works for you. Experiment. Always bring redundancies with you. It's okay to go overkill with your fire kit, because it's always better to be over-prepared than under-prepared. So anyway, go out, experiment, and see what works for you.